The conflict in Ukraine escalates, with Russian forces gaining more control of the country. And fears grow that the capital, Kyiv, could fall within days. Hello, everyone. I'm Asiye Namdar, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. An escalating crisis in Ukraine, with Russia's military making further advances. The UN Security Council voting to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine has just failed. Russia vetoed the resolution. There were 11 in support of that resolution and 3 abstentions. China and India are among the countries that abstained. Meanwhile, President Zelenskyy is urging Ukrainians to defend their country. Thousands of Ukrainians are fleeing the war as they seek safety in neighboring countries. We begin our coverage with CGTN correspondent Guy Henderson, who's been covering that part of the story.
We're now making our way all the way down the main highway, all the way to Lviv, and at some point, if we can, to cross the Polish border, although we hear there's extremely long queues at that Polish border because we are by no means the only people who've been on this road. The road's a little clearer now as we've moved a few hundred kilometers on, but in the early stages, everyone had the same idea as us. It was absolutely packed because it has been an intense day of shelling and fighting around the outskirts of Kyiv. There are 2.8 million people. That's the population of Kyiv. It will be far fewer now, and people, from what we understand, are continuing to flee. It's also interesting to note, along the way here, we've seen checkpoints. We've seen tanks, some stationary, some being redeployed in what is a continually fluid situation. Ukrainian officials are not keen not to give too much away about their maneuvering, but you get the sense that they are preparing for a defense of Western Ukraine. At the moment, though, of course, the focus of the Russian attack in this part of Ukraine, at least, is very much on Kyiv. That is where we were earlier. We'd, from our hotel, heard a couple of gunshots out on the street outside, but it was a few kilometers up the road where Russian soldiers Russian saboteurs were engaged in a gunfight with Ukrainian armed forces personnel. We then had another round of missile strikes on the neighborhood that we were staying in. The sirens went up. We went down into the bomb shelters, and along with all of the other residents of Kyiv in that region. And of course, that's something that people have had to get used to in the last few days. And as soon as that window opened, out we went with a flood of other civilians.
Guy Henderson there. Well, so much to talk about. Joining me from Switzerland is Sergiy Kudelia. He's an associate professor of political science at Baylor University and a specialist on Ukraine. Also here with us in Washington, Anton Fedyashin, a Russian expert and a professor of history at American University. Also joining us, Michael O'Hanlon. He's a senior fellow and director of research in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. And from Rhode Island, Vladimir Golstein. He's a chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University and commentator on Russian foreign policy. Welcome to all of you. Let me begin with Sergiy. We want to begin really with getting a sense, Sergiy, of what the situation is on the ground right now. We are hearing Kyiv could fall within days. What are you hearing? And can Ukrainian troops, for how much longer can they put up resistance?
Well, the situation on the ground really differs. There has been a number of assaults from different directions. One assault from Russia came from the south. Many troops from Crimea have been moving up to capture a number of cities in southern Ukraine. Two of the largest cities in southern Ukraine that are now the Russians are now trying to capture and are shelling constantly are Mykolaiv and Kherson. Several other smaller towns have been taken over. Melitopol, another town in southern Ukraine. Apparently there are Russian military vehicles already riding through that town. On the other hand, there is also an assault from the border with Belarus to the northern part of Ukraine. And there were attempts to capture a number of towns as well. There were attempts to capture Sumy, attempts to capture Chernihiv. These are all large cities, the oblast centers. None of these attacks, none of these attempts succeeded so far. And as a result, when Russians faced significant resistance from the local forces, they realized that they need to move on further to Kyiv. And Kyiv is really a few hundred kilometers away from the border with Belarus. So the main assault right now, as you mentioned, is happening around Kyiv.
Vladimir, if the government of Ukraine, in fact, is overthrown, then what? What is Vladimir Putin's objective here? Does he want to occupy and control Ukraine, a country of 44 million people? What is the end game here?
Well, I guess your guess is as good as mine. We were frequently commentating on the affairs, and I have to acknowledge that not many people expected this such a powerful invasion, was such a strong one. So it's hard to guess, but at least officially, Kremlin says that it's going to be temporary, activity. They will want to what they call denazify, demilitarize. How it is translated in concrete terms, it's very hard to say. I suspect they want either to negotiate. There were rumors that they want to negotiate with Zelenskyy, who offered to neutrality, then he backed off from that. They basically want somebody who will say that our country in the future will be neutral. I don't think Russians are interested in grabbing the land, in occupying the country, but they definitely want to do their best, A, to degrade their military, and B, to have some kind of regime which will be neutral rather than highly sympathetic to the United States and highly eager to enter NATO.
But is it up to Russia to decide what kind of government Ukraine can have?
I think it's either they will negotiate or they would probably. The problem is that we have to be aware that Ukraine is divided. So there are some, eastern parts. There will be, their candidates who might be much more sympathetic. So it's very hard to say. Will it be open for election? Will he try to put somebody who will sort of appeal to the West and to the east of Ukraine? It's, I don't venture to go there.
Well, Anton, I'm just wondering, was this crisis, this war, this assault on Ukraine, was it really ever about NATO and the West not meeting Vladimir Putin's security demands?
Yes, I believe it was. The tragedy of Ukraine is that it was caught on a geopolitical fault line between the West and Russia. It was caught on a fault line that has been emerging as the unipolar US-led world order unravels. This doesn't justify what's going on now, because the war is now the Kremlin's to own and to be responsible for. But ultimately, this is about security. Now, how the Russians are now going to negotiate and maneuver themselves into a situation where they have sufficient control of an enormous territory with a population, a good chunk of which will not be on their side, and at the same time convince them of some kind of neutrality is completely unclear to me.
Michael, I want to get your take on this. Is this really about security, and how far is Vladimir Putin willing to go? Did he overreach, underestimate the global condemnation of this assault, really without any provocation?
Right. Well, let me agree with most of what I've heard so far. And I think that Mr. Putin's going to find a Ukraine that is not sympathetic to what he's doing, even in the East. And what I've learned from, I'm not a Ukraine expert, but spent a lot of time with Stephen Pfeiffer, former U.S. ambassador there, others, Bill Taylor, Jeffrey Herbst, a lot of people who know the country well and who've tracked the public opinion polling and the elections in recent times. I know a lot of my co-panelists tonight know a great deal about Ukraine. And certainly, one thing Putin's managed to achieve in the last 8 or 10 years is to create a stronger sense of Ukrainian nationality and nationhood and a distinct identity from that of Russia. So to get an acceptable outcome that keeps Ukraine neutral is going to take more than just getting the next government to oppose, NATO membership. It's going to take something more binding. It's going to take a change to the Constitution. And I think even that is something Putin may decide is inadequate. What he really would like is a Lukashenko-like figure, the president of Belarus, of somebody who's essentially in his court, who does much of his own becking, who's sort of a crony, who sees the world and the region the same way, and who could stay in power for a long time, or some way to create successive Lukashenkos. In other words, for Russia to control Ukrainian politics at some level. And the other possibility, let's face it, is that Russia will just take part of Ukraine, although it has to risk, in that case, some kind of an insurgency, even if it's in the relatively historically more pro-Russian East. So Putin doesn't have great choices. And I do think the world will condemn him. It'll be fascinating, if you don't mind my saying so, to watch China's reaction in all of this. Because China will be one of the few places Putin could look for some succor and some solace and alternative markets if we start cutting off his exports of oil and gas in the West, as I think we should. I think we should develop a plan over the next 3 to 5 years to wean ourselves off Russian oil and gas. How can you do business with somebody who's slicing up other countries? So Putin's in a dilemma, and he's decided that settling old scores and expanding Russia's territorial domain matters more to him than the prosperity of his own people or than the peace and stability of the region he inhabits. He's a pretty nasty guy, and he's made a bad choice.
And one of the reasons he's justified this military operation, if you will, Ukraine says this is an invasion, and NATO and its allies say this is an invasion. But regardless of what we want to call it, the reason that he has justified this is because he says Ukraine's government is full of drug addicts and neo-Nazis. Listen to what he had to say.
Once again, I appeal to the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. Do not let neo-Nazis and Banderovsky use your children, wives, and the elderly as human shields. Take power into your own hands. It seems that will be easier for us to agree than with this gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis who settled in Kyiv and took the entire Ukrainian people hostage.
Sergiy, what is he talking about? By the way, not the first time we've heard the word Nazi or heard the comparison with Nazis in a country which, by the way, has a Jewish leader.
That's exactly right. It is ridiculous what he is saying. There is no other word to describe it. It is also understandable from the standpoint of his political communication to the Russian society. Over the last day or 2 days, by different estimates, around 500 Russian soldiers have been already killed. Many more will be killed in the next days. And ultimately, there will be a question. What are the Russians dying for exactly in Ukraine? Why are these young Russians suddenly dying near Kherson or Kyiv or Kharkiv? Exactly the kinds of cities that Ukrainians and Russians together were liberating during World War II. And of course, for Putin, the only answer he can come up with is they're all Nazis all over again, because he understands that Russians have an emotional response to the word Nazi, because he understands that this is the only way he can justify and cover up his aggression against a neighboring state. And let me emphasize one more thing. Vladimir was talking about how divided Ukraine is, but you understand that the assault that is happening right now is happening on the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. These are areas where the majority of the population speaks Russian. Southern Ukraine, Kherson, Mykolaiv. These are the areas which overwhelmingly supported pro-Russian political parties. And guess what? Do you see any support of these local people for the Russian troops? Do you see anyone with Russian flags welcoming there or with flowers? Of course not. People are angry, people are shocked, people are upset, people are willing to resist. And this type of unification of the Ukrainian people that happened after 2014 will be even stronger after that type of assault that we are seeing right now in Ukraine.
Vladimir, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll be very happy to respond to that because I think the situation is unclear. People are scared when there is a war, when there's an invasion. You don't know what you're going to be, how you're going to behave. So it remains to be seen. But we know historically that the eastern part of Ukraine always complain about, attacks from Ukrainian government. There is this battalion Azov, which is, consists of ultra-nationalists. So basically Nazis, of course, I agree with Sergiy, this is a trigger term, but it's naive to deny presence of ultra-nationalists in many parts of Ukraine. These are the people who, had, murders, burned people in Odessa. These are the people who continued shelling Donbass and Donetsk. And I want to stress that this is the information, this is the shots on TV which Russian people see. So they respond to that. It's there. I'm not a specialist on sort of demographics, but we know there were definitely polls, regular polls in Donetsk region and Donbass region conducted by Kyiv, and a lot of people want to be separated. So I wouldn't say that it's just unifiedly pro-Russian, but I would say it's unifiedly pro-Ukrainian. Definitely, I agree with Sergei that the war will push people toward Kyiv because it's unexpected. Well, but how the things will fall out is not clear.
Let me move on to what we've also seen with these war protests. We've seen them in Moscow, we've seen them in St. Petersburg. More than 1,700 people have been arrested. I'm just wondering, Vladimir, could this operation backfire for Putin at home? You've got mounting casualties, you've got refugees, Ukrainians fleeing to Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. Optics are not good here for Putin.
Well, from what last poll I read in Russia, about 60% actually approve of that. So we have to be aware of where Russia stands. We always are very sensitive, say, to Polish or Ukrainian or Baltic sensitivities, fear of Russian invasion. You can add to that Czechs and Hungarians or whatever who were invaded. But Russia is a culture which is shaped by the fear of Western invasions. They were invaded by everyone except the United States, and now the United States with NATO is a threat. So like for 500 years, Russia, the only thing they would do is like to fight invasion of Poland, invasion of Sweden, invasion of
Vladimir,
France.
I'm going to interrupt you. My apologies. China's UN Ambassador Zhang Jun is speaking right now. Let's take a listen.
The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be jointly upheld. We have always called on all parties to seek reasonable solutions to address each other's concerns through peaceful means on the basis of equality and mutual benefit. We welcome and encourage all efforts for a diplomatic solution, and we support the Russian Federation and Ukraine in resolving the issue through negotiations. In the past week, the Security Council has held 2 emergency meetings, and all parties have fully elaborated on their positions and concerns on the current situation. At present, faced with a highly complex and sensitive situation, the Security Council should make a necessary response. At the same time, such a response should also be taken with great caution. All actions should be truly conducive to defusing the crisis, rather than adding fuel to fire. If not handled properly and treated by bending oneself on exerting pressure and imposing sanctions, it may only lead to more casualties, more property loss, a more complicated and chaotic situation, and more difficulties in bridging differences. It may completely shut the door to a peaceful solution, and eventually, it is the vast number of innocent people that will be the victims. We must draw profound lessons from the extremely painful experience in the past. Based on the above-mentioned, China abstained in the vote just now. I wish to stress that the issue of Ukraine is not something that only emerged today, nor did the current situation occur suddenly, overnight. It's It is the result of the interplay of various factors over a long period of time. China advocates a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security concept, believing, as it does, that the security of one country cannot come at the cost of undermining the security of other nations, and that much less can regional security be secured through group strengthening and, from that matter, group expansion. Against the backdrop of 5 successive rounds of NATO expansion, Russia's legitimate security aspirations should be given attention and addressed properly. Ukraine should become a bridge between the East and the West, not an outpost for confrontation between major powers. We strongly call upon all parties concerned to exercise maximum restraint, ease tensions.
You have been listening to China's United Nations Ambassador, Ambassador ZHANG, once again stating China's position in this crisis, that China wants a diplomatic solution, favors negotiation. China is one of the 3 countries that abstained from a resolution condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. Okay, I was in the middle of a different conversation and we got interrupted to go to the UN Security Council. Anton and Michael, this question is for you. Sanctions, are they effective, number 1? And number 2, Michael, do you envision a scenario where US and its NATO allies would be pulled into this conflict? Anton, let me go to you first.
Sure, Asia. The West's role in this is somewhat of a mystery to me. We've spoken already about the cynicism of the Russian actions that the whole world is seeing unfolding. I have to say that the role of the United States seems, although not directly complicit, also strangely cynical to me. First of all, in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, when Ukraine and Georgia were encouraged to aspire to NATO membership, but not accepted, not even given a membership action plan map, in large part because of German and French opposition. This was the beginning of a very big problem, not just for the Russians, who of course were very concerned about this, but for the Ukrainians themselves. They have essentially been given a promise to join a military alliance, but given absolutely no security
Anton,
assurance.
Apologies, but my question was actually about sanctions. Are these sanctions going to make a difference? And in the latest development, EU and US agreed to freeze European assets of Vladimir Putin and his foreign minister, Sergey Lavrov. If we could just focus on the sanctions part, I would really appreciate it.
We could. They're not going to have much of an effect at all. First of all, high-placed Russian officials are, by law, not allowed to have to have property, real estate, bank accounts abroad to begin with. If they do so at their own risk. Sanctions in the history of international relations, be they against North Korea, Iran, Iraq, or any other country, Syria also, have never been shown to work, and Russia is more resilient. Are they going to hurt? However, yes, but sanctions are not diplomacy, and sanctions are not strategy. And diplomacy and strategy is something that I've not yet seen on the part of the West. All sides have failed.
Michael, before I go to you, I want to play a clip of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy basically saying he's not getting enough help from NATO. Let's take a listen.
This morning, we are defending our country alone. Just like yesterday, the most powerful country in the world looked on from a distance. Russia was hit with sanctions yesterday, but these are not enough to get these foreign troops off our soil. Only through solidarity and determination can this be achieved.
Zelenskyy basically saying he asked 27 EU leaders about the prospects of NATO membership, and no one answered. Michael.
Well, I thought Anton did a nice job with the history, and I've always thought it was questionable for NATO to want to expand to include Ukraine and Georgia. And in fact, NATO couldn't even quite make up its mind back in 2008, as Anton pointed out. So we had this compromise of an indefinite sort of waiting period. That was probably a half-pregnant kind of a solution that wasn't very smart from any perspective. Let me be clear, though. I do understand why Russians can feel psychologically offended that an alliance that was set up to deal with a Soviet threat that no longer exists would continue to expand eastward. But Russians don't have any reason and never have had any reason to feel militarily threatened. Now, I was against the idea of trying to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. I thought we made a mistake, but we were not malevolent. We were not looking to bring Ukraine in so we could threaten Russia. And Putin knew that. Putin was acting in this case not because of any legitimate security concern, but because of an offended sense of pride about Russian greatness being trampled upon in his mind over the last 30 years. I think that kind of reaction was predictable, which is one of the reasons why I opposed NATO inviting Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance. But it doesn't mean that that reaction is justifiable or that it is based in any kind of true security analysis. And I wish the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations had pointed that out. Now, I realize China doesn't like America's alliances either, and China's friendly to Putin. But I think it's time to speak plainly that when one country attacks another, and yes, it was an invasion, and yes, it is an invasion, and there's no semantic ambiguity about that choice of words, we have to unify against. So it's, to me, really a shame that China is staying today.
Sergiy and Vladimir, do you think diplomacy still here has a chance? I mean, what will it do at this point?
I
do not think that.
Vladimir, you go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with the Chinese ambassador to UN that security of Russia should be considered and should be negotiated, because as he said, it hasn't been just happened today. It's been brewing there. And I don't agree with Michael, who says that Russia doesn't feel threatened, that it's only about Putin paranoia. If we're going to approach big countries with their policies, which are shaped by centuries of history, only as a whim of a leader, we're not going to go anywhere.
Well, I know, but my question was specifically, maybe I should move on to Anton here, because we're running out of time, if diplomacy still has a chance.
Yes.
That's it? You don't like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think they should definitely sit together and discuss and make sure that Ukrainian interests to be a breach in Europe, to be successful and prosperous country are addressed. Russian security concerns are addressed. And the United States should back off from Europe and negotiate peaceful solution rather than dictating from Washington how every country should begin.
We'll have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Sergiy, Vladimir, Anton, and Michael, we certainly appreciate your time. An important discussion. Thank you for joining us on another edition of The Heat.